Good afternoon, everyone. We might get started again. What a great morning of discussion. I just have to say I'm very grateful that we were able to set up as a digital first regulator, because we have 99% of online lodgements. It took a lot of effort to get there, and it still is one of the main support services we provide to charities that call up to help them use the online services. But it's actually quite lovely when you've got an 80-year-old board member on the phone with their 12-year-old grandchild with one of our staff members, and the joy that they have in having actually achieved an online lodgement is quite heartwarming, I have to say. My name's Rachel Smith. Many of you will know me already. I'm the Director of Advice Services, Education and Public Affairs. And this session's a regular on our agenda at this conference. It's a chance to hear the latest updates from the ACNC Directors. I'm going to introduce my colleagues from the far side. We've got Mel Yates, who's the Director of Reporting, Red Tape Reduction and Corporate Services, which I think might be the longest title in the organisation. Sally Ann Stonier, Director of Registrations. Rob Jackson, who's the Director of IT, Joanna Austin, Director of Legal and Policy, and James Bennett, who's our Director of Compliance. Now, our most recent corporate plan was published yesterday. It's on our website if you'd like to have a look at it. And it sets out the next phase for the ACNC's work under the leadership of Sue. So today's session we're going to focus a little bit around the themes in that corporate plan. But first I'd like to ask Mel if he can provide just a bit of an overview of the approach we've taken to the performance measures in the new corporate plan.
As unprepared as I am, I'm wearing a lapel mic and I just realised I forgot to turn it on. So thank you, Sally. Thank you very, very much. Well, as Sue mentioned this morning, this is a very new release. So we released our corporate plan yesterday. Some key information is that our purposes have not changed. Our purposes align to our objects in the ACNC Act. Our vision is unchanged, and that is charities that inspire confidence and respect. But what has changed is we've developed 4 strategic priorities, and they are the charity register, supporting charities and building capability, using our data to maximum effect, and organisational capability. And as part of that, we've taken the opportunity to refresh our performance measures to better reflect the work we do and improve how our performance is assessed. Now, these performance measures all link to our 4 strategic priorities. We have included some new performance measures, and that's to better reflect the breadth of the work that we do at the ACNC. For existing performance measures, we have been a bit more specific in those measures and how they will be assessed. And to enhance transparency, we have included a lot of additional information at the end of the corporate plan, specifically about each of those measures, how they have changed. And so that really helps stakeholders understand our rationale, the background to the performance measures, and how they may have changed from previous years.
Thanks, Mel. So the charity register is at the heart of what we do. We promote it as a source of truth on registered charities. So keeping it accurate and up to date is our first priority. It enables us to promote trust and confidence in charities, particularly a useful tool for donors and philanthropists to look at what charities do, find out about their financials. And the ACNC made a submission to the productivity inquiry into philanthropy recently and drew heavily on the value of the register in that submission. And I was going to ask Jo if she could tell us a bit about that, please.
Sure can. Thanks, Rachel. And look, I'm going to give an overview of the aspect of the submission that related to the register, but I will accept absolutely no credit for the preparation of the submission. That was done by lots of other clever people at the ACNC. So yeah, it was a big part of our submission, and accuracy of the register is something that we're constantly working towards, and it's critically important to maintain, protect and enhance public trust and confidence in the sector. I was really interested to hear the contribution from David at Info Exchange this morning, because it just keeps reminding me about how important it is that data is rich and accurate. We looked, in our submission, we reported that register use is increasing rapidly, 5.6 million searches over the period 1 July, 5.6 million searches over the period 1 July to 30 June 22, and 6.5 million searches this year to the end of March. I think that difference is really fascinating. As most of you would know, a lot of the information from the register is drawn from the AIS. And as Rachel indicated, the public, researchers, other government agencies, philanthropists, they regularly ask us, they enjoy and need to use that information, and they ask us whether additional information can be published on the register. And we made this as part of the submission as well. Things like whether a charity has DGR endorsement, more comprehensive information about formally registered charities, and grounds for revocation. It won't be news to anyone that we can't do everything. It's important that, I guess, as a reminder that a lot of this data comes out of the AIS, and we noted that we just have to be careful in balancing getting that rich data, but also not imposing too much on the sector. But as you would gather as well, with the secrecy provisions changing, some of those requests will be coming through. I also need to, I've decided as part of this contribution, quickly note, and I wonder if some of you others have also seen this, that last night there was an update from the Treasury about something really important that's been raised at Regulators Day and indeed CLANS in the last couple of years. And I think it's appropriate in this section to quickly mention the Treasury Laws Amendment Combating Illegal Financing Act in 2020 introduced reforms to combat illegal financing of companies, and that introduced 203AA of the Corporations Act. Long story short, the result was the resignation of a company director for a not-for-profit body can't take effect until a notice is provided to both ASIC and the ACNC. Really inconvenient. An amendment is proposed. This has been a really long time coming. The explanatory materials are there, and it's going to be put through, we hope, as part of the miscellaneous and technical amendments process. So I'm excited, and I hope the rest of you are as well. Thank you, Rachel.
Thanks. One of the main outcomes of the DGR reviews that we undertake is to help keep the register accurate. And I was going to ask Sally if she could give us a bit of an update on that work.
Hello everybody, and I hope you can all hear me. I know everybody's interested in this, so I hope you're all awake after lunch. As most of you will know here, that the ACNC is funded to review 2% of DGR endorsed charities each year, and that equates to about 500 charities, bearing in mind that some come off during the year, some come on, so it's a fluctuating number. And the focus of our reviews in 2022-23 expanded. Previously, we had been looking just at public benevolent institutions, and we heard some feedback around particularly the Commissioner's interpretation statement and how some of the work we might be doing at the review stage may well change. So we expanded to include other DGR categories, and that actually has helped us with some of our learnings So some of the things that we learnt in the very early years around what we were finding with just the PBI charities, we've actually been able to look at those learnings and see what's come out of some of the other DGR categories. So we expanded it to include things like school building funds, animal welfare charities, public libraries, which of course are very, very different beneficiary groups. We look at the register from two perspectives. We look at it from charity entitlement. So clearly we don't want charities on the organisations on the register that are not charities. And we also look at it from an accuracy perspective. So making sure that governing documents are there, making sure that the responsible people are noted. And one of the main things I think that's really important to note is that we look at these with a risk-based approach each year. So there's about now, I believe, 26,500 DGR endorsed charities on our register. And we identify through that risk approach a cohort that meet the criteria that we're going to look at that year. So, for example, we wouldn't look at ORIT charities or highly regulated charities. We would exclude those from the cohort, but we would look at those that had been registered prior to the ACNC being legislated, or some with higher risk factors, like no governing documents, for example. And out of that cohort, what we do, we randomly select the 500 because we don't want our approach to be influenced by what we think we're going to find. And I think that's something that's really important to note, that whilst these all fall within the higher risk category, it is a selection, a random selection of that cohort. I know there was a great deal of interest yesterday, and we will be producing a report on our findings, but you might have to wait a bit longer for that. But I can tell you that this year, of the reviews we've conducted, 30% of them we've helped with administrative issues. 37% were closed because they were absolutely entitled and there were no administrative issues with them. And there are 33% that have come out requiring more detailed work. So that's the real contribution to the work we're doing about the DGR review work for the integrity. And I think, without actually quoting me on this, but we're just under 1,300 that we have reviewed during the time we've been working on this programme. Thanks, Rach.
Thanks, Al. Of course, the work that compliance do also plays a critical role in maintaining the integrity of the register. So I was going to ask James if you could tell us a bit about how you assess risk and give us an update on the investigation work that we do.
Sure, can do. So look, I guess at a strategic level, we really focus on material risks, and that leads most of our casework towards either looking at how charities are controlling and protecting their assets, or how they are protecting the people with which they're working, their beneficiaries usually. The way we assess risk, I guess, there's different points during a case. So prior to allocation, we'll look at complaints that we've received. We also use the data from the AIS to try and spot elements of risk. We've also worked into a few different areas in terms of a lot of analysis. So we take those three things to really understand where we think there's risks and choose cases. As we get into a case, initially we use all the information available to us to sort of say, what are the risks that are affecting this charity? And then we'll engage with the charity to gather evidence to see what is actually going on with them. So in most of our investigation work, we do find some problems that we want to look into and get into, and maybe the risk level sort of starts up here. And as we work with the charity, they sort of understand how they're affected and often move to change governance. And what we see is the level of risk that charity is carrying lower over the course of our engagement with them. In the last year, we revoked about 13% of the charities that we investigated. That's a number that's been consistent over the last few years. And what it means is in those other cases, we've engaged, we've discussed with the charity, and we've seen the improvement to the point that revocation wasn't a proportional response anymore. We'll finish off with some education to those charities, and they'll continue to go back to their good work, and they'll do it with stronger governance than we started.
Thanks, James. During the pandemic, we saw a great leap forward in innovation for good and evil. So it's really accelerated instances of cybercrime, and cybersecurity has become a much more important issue for all organisations that hold data. So I was going to ask Rob if he could just give us an update on our plans to improve the way we protect the data that we collect from charities.
Sure, no problem, Rachel. Excuse me, my voice is a little bit soft today. So obviously we've been using multi-factor authentication within the organisation for quite a few years now. I think majority of people are pretty familiar with MFA these days, post-pandemic, to get into your banking or other platforms. So we're looking at extending that out to the charity portal. That's something that we're looking at doing over the next 6 months. Now we'll have a bit of community consultation before we do that, just to make sure we get the settings right. There's obviously different ways that you can do multi-factor authentication. You know, it might be via email or text message, so we just need to get the settings right before we do that, and just to ensure that we don't cause too much disruption. But it's a really effective tool for minimising cyber intrusion into the environment. More broadly, we use something called the Protective Security Policy Framework, the PSPF, which is a really comprehensive set of policies developed by government. We use that to inform our policy settings internally, specifically around cyber security, information security, and lots of things around information. So that's really key to how we set our policies. More specifically, the Essential 8 is a great tool that we use internally, which you may know about. That's something put together by the Australian Cyber Security Centre. And that's a set of 8 prioritised strategies that are aimed at minimising cyber risk. So we do annual reviews of our maturity against the Essential 8. That's a really important thing to do. And then I guess just touching on the Australian Cyber Security Centre, I did want to just point out that they are an excellent resource to charities. There's a lot of content on there that they create. I've been in their ear for a while now to try and get some better offerings for the charity sector. So perhaps I'll keep doing that. But I do know that early 2024, they're doing some targeted campaigns directly at charities. So I think there might be something coming out about that. That's probably all for me.
Thanks, Rob. Last year there were some regulatory changes to improve public trust and confidence that resulted in some changes to questions that will be asked in the AIS and what will be published on the register. Mel, could you give us a bit of an update on those changes?
Sure. So there was 3 primary changes that came into effect in 2022 in terms of one being the increase to size thresholds. So effectively what happened is the small size charity threshold doubled. So that is up to, or it's actually below 500,000. Medium then kicks in from $500,000 in annual revenue, and that applies to below 3 million. And then large sized charities are those with revenue of $3 million or more. So that increase in the size thresholds has retained the same assurance requirements. So one of the benefits of that was that there is a cohort of charities that no longer need to have an audit or no longer need to have a review. So that's a red tape reduction, a resource saving for the sector. The second change that came in 2022 was the introduction of statement of resources and commitments. Now that only applies to small-sized entities, and that enables those small-sized entities that use cash accounting, they can provide descriptions of their assets and liabilities. So they can be brief descriptions or they can be as detailed as the charity wants them to be. The third change is the introduction of key management personnel reporting. So that applies to large-sized charities only. Now, I'm talking in terms of the annual information statement. Obviously, entities who are medium-sized and may be preparing general purpose financial statements, they still have ongoing obligations to include this information. But this new requirement came into play for those entities who are preparing special purpose financial statements, large in size. There is some exemptions. So the way that was introduced, organisations or charities that only have one individual throughout the reporting period, to maintain privacy, there is an exemption from reporting information, but otherwise we require aggregated total amount of remuneration to be included, and that applies to paid senior executives and paid responsible people. So I would commend you to look at the guidance that we developed in an iterative way on our website, and that is www.acnc.gov.au/KMP, so a very easy link to remember there. And an upcoming change, which is nearly upon us when we launch the 2023 Annual Information Statement, will be the introduction of related party transaction reporting. Now, we know that this is a massive change for the sector. We talked about this morning and some of the challenges that this poses for the sector. So again, we have really worked hard, particularly with our colleagues internally in the education and communication space, to develop guidance in an iterative way. We consulted with our forums on how we would implement this to minimise the red tape burden but provide meaningful information. We had public consultation. We also had many focused one-to-one meetings with different charities and stakeholders to really understand some of the nuances and some of the complexities that they experience, which is relevant to the guidance and the way we finally settled on the implementation plan. And one of the biggest things we did, and Sue was really instrumental in this, was making sure that we communicated to all entities to make sure that they were aware of this new reporting obligation and were aware of the resources that were available and that call to action, that they really need to start to understand what this means, what information they need to collect, and how it's going to be reported in the annual information statement. And I might take the opportunity, I know there were some questions posed in the earlier session before lunch in relation to donations and reluctance of directors to disclose donations that they may be making to a charity. Clearly in our guidance, and it's slightly different for smalls compared to medium and large, but we have been clear in the guidance that generally we would expect donations from related parties not to be reportable or not to be material. So I do draw your attention to that. Again, I commend the guidance to you. There is another short link for that, and that's acnc.gov.au/RPT. So please avail yourselves of that guidance. And we're always open if there's changes that still need to be made, if there are issues or problems or concerns or something may not be clear, we are always open to hearing that feedback and working constructively to make sure that the guidance is relevant and does actually support the sector.
And that has segued very neatly into our second priority of supporting charities and building capabilities, which is my favourite one. Last year at this event we launched the first few of our online learning offering that we developed last year, the last of which were released just before Christmas, I think. Since then we've had over 11,500 enrolments, and feedback from participants, 93% of participants have indicated they felt they gained new knowledge or skills from learning it. I know a lot of people in the room actually contributed to the development of those materials, so thank you. And we'll obviously continue to look at other ways that we can support organisations in new ways, and I've even today at lunchtime had some really good suggestions from people, which is terrific. We also reviewed all 990 pages of our website in the last 6 months to remove duplication, update or remove outdated material, and identify areas where we could improve what the content that's already there. So you'll hopefully find if you look there, there'll be less, it'll be easier to navigate and a bit more accessible, some of that information. Sue already mentioned the guidance that we released since she started on crypto assets and advocacy for the planned referendum on Indigenous Voice to Parliament. We also just added on all our guidance pages now should have what I call a feedback widget on the bottom. So you can actually now tell us whether you think guidance was helpful and why, or why not it was or wasn't. And feedback from users of the web content, as well as analysis of the inquiries that we get through the contact centre, are really key sources of intelligence for us on how we can improve our offerings in a very targeted way. And guidance is something that is infiltrates all the work we all do, really. Sally, you've done a lot of consultation in the last year to look at ways to improve the approach to the DGR reviews, and our teams have also worked together on a range of tools to help the work that your team do. Can you tell us a bit about some of those initiatives?
Sure, thanks Rachel. And many of you who were here last year will recall me saying that we would commit to doing consultation around the DGR reviews, and we heard what you said. We did facilitated consultation with the advisor and the sector forums, and then we sought written feedback from the consultation panel. We also went directly out to charities that hadn't been part of a DGR review. And so all of that feedback was fantastic, and it's helped us to improve our processes and the way we communicate with the charities around those review processes. And I think that was one of the things that we heard very clearly, was that we haven't got it right. I'm hoping that we're getting it a bit more right now, but of course consultation never stops, so any feedback would always be very happily received. But as a result of that feedback, we've made certain key changes, and I think some of those would be pretty obvious to anybody who's seen them. We've amended our email and letter templates that go out so that they are much more supportive to the charity, and hopefully they are much clearer around the review. One of the other things that we changed was our introductory email. Now, what we originally did was we sent an email out to all of the people in the cohort that might be selected for review, and we heard that that panicked a lot of people, and we didn't want that to happen, and that was the last thing we would expect to do. And so now we don't do that. What we do is when we've looked at the actual ones that we are going to review, we only reach out to those that are going to need some contact with us, and we allocate somebody who will be their contact point and can work with them and provide the guidance through it and give them an explanation of what's going on, so that they get the time to reflect a bit, but they've also got a contact that they can call and talk to. And I think that's made things significantly easier for those charities that are selected, whilst not worrying all those that we're never going to actually get a review from us. The other thing that we heard, and I think this is something that is really valid and we hadn't actually thought of, was that when we contact who is listed as the contact for the charity, it probably wasn't the right person to deal with the review. And quite often it was the administrative person who saw it as spam or didn't do anything with it. So one of the changes we have made is actually on that first phone call, that first contact, asking who the most appropriate person is to deal with the review, who we can have the ongoing conversations with. So those are some of the key changes that we made as a result of the consultation that we had, and I just want to again reiterate how valuable it was. Interestingly, we started the reviews in 2020, and at that time 55% of the charities required assistance to be compliant. In 2022 it had gone down to 24%. And this year, it's 14%. So that is, I think, a tremendous improvement and tells us something about the information that we're actually getting out there to help the charities understand what we're doing. And just finally, Rach, just finally, she's going to do this in a minute and tell me to shut up. I'm just picking up on what Jennifer said earlier about the self-assessing income tax exempt charities. We've been working very closely with that team and EPA to develop guidance that will help any not-for-profits that might be impacted, and we've got a landing page up there that if you haven't looked at it, go and look at it, and we'll continue to improve that as the next year goes and we understand how it's going to progress. Thanks, Rach.
Thanks. And that can be accessed via one of the sliders on our homepage. Now, we deliver a few communications campaigns each year, like Safe Giving and Scams Awareness, to raise awareness in the community and encourage use of the register before people think of giving money to an organisation that's a charity. And we also work on a range of campaigns informed by the work done by areas such as registrations, reporting and compliance. I was going to ask James, like fraud awareness is one of them, and compliance reviews are another area that we're looking at how we can leverage the work that compliance does to improve our education offerings for the sector. Could you talk a bit about that work, please, James?
Can do. So the compliance reviews got funded a few years ago to look into issues in the charity sector, and we use them to try and provide guidance to charities who may be affected by those sort of issues. So every year the way we run it is we pick a couple of issues and then find cohorts of charities that may have it, engage with those charities, learn about where these problems might be manifesting, but also examples of better practice. And where we can, we take that and we publish guidance or update our guidance accordingly. So in terms of the way it's worked, earlier this calendar year, we consulted on cohorts to do this financial year. We spoke with the advisor forum and the sector forum. We got a very strong message that we should do a group on cybersecurity in the charity sector. So what we'd be wanting to do is talk to charities. I think it's going to be quite broad, but also for example, who carry significant personal information about their beneficiaries, and say, what are you doing about this risk? What's working for you? What's not working? And what we want to do is share that at the end. In the last financial year, we published findings coming out of cohorts that we did into charities that run programs overseas for children, a range of different types of programs. And we updated the guidance on the website about it. We also emailed out to charities that we could identify were engaged in this sort of activity to draw their attention to particularly good practices in that particular cohort. The one we're finalising at the moment is looking at founders syndrome. So where there's a founder, an individual who remains with the charity and has had really strong influence on them. So we haven't finalised our analysis of the cases at the high level, but I guess early sort of indicators that we're seeing is for those who did have that dominant sort of founder, about half needed to improve their financial management, a bit under half were not doing their conflict of interest as well as they could. Some interesting sorts of bit of pieces where there are also family members working within the charity. The conflict of interest issues were higher, where the founder was paid and or gave contracts to their related parties. Those decision-making weren't perhaps as transparent as we'd like. What I would say is the good practice that we sort of saw was good governance in these charities with the founder were correlated with skilled and independent people joining the boards. Can't tell you which way those go, but it's obvious that bringing in that sort of the skilled and the independent person contributes to the quality of governance within those sort of charities. So we're going to take that work, we're going to finalise it and wrap it up, and then I'll be talking to Rachel's team about guidance that we might be able to update on our website. The point being, other charities can learn from that experience, self-reflect, and improve their governance as well.
Thanks, James. Commissioner interpretation statements, something that's always of interest to people at this conference. Important guidance for both the sector and our staff. And I was going to ask Jo if she could give us a bit of an update on the review of those policy documents.
Certainly can. So I think most people in the room today know about the statements. I'll call them CISs. We have 7, and as Rachel indicated, they guide charities, advisors and the public on how we interpret the law. While these documents aren't binding in law, we'll apply them when making decisions, and they'll be updated when the law changes. We've embarked on a refresh and review of the CISs over the last couple of years, and it does take a while. They're complex documents, and we're really keen to get it right. In 2021, we revised the CIS that deals with the provision of housing by charities. Maybe you can't hear me. Now you can. It was just because I was getting to the good part. So in 2021, we revised the CIS that deals with the provision of housing by charities. And very recently, after extensive public consultation and consultation with the advisor and sector panels, we published a revised version of the Health Promotion Charities CIS in June, so very, very recently. And as we've mentioned a couple of times of recent days, we're really looking forward to publishing the revised CIS on public benevolent institutions. Yes, it's been a long time coming, but we've done that proper consultation, taken on board a lot of the feedback and had some, I think, terrific debates, principally with advisors, while revising this really, really important document. I think what's important is that it's readable to the community. It's still difficult, there's no way of getting around that, but I'm excited by the fact that it includes some excellent examples. It's clearly written, and that really matters, I think, for the community. We're also continuing to work on the balance of the CISs. I wanted to also mention that the policy part of my team, and not just us, we work across the agency, and particularly with Rachel's team, we make policy submissions on a whole range of matters to the states and to Commonwealth government on the impact of their proposals on the charity sector. These submissions might relate to the impact of proposed laws that we'll have on the sector or on broader policy proposals. To think of a few recent ones that I think have been really important is, critically so, the Commonwealth Government's approach to cybersecurity and the emerging risks in that space that we've seen in recent years in the form of very serious incidents. We've also contributed to submissions on proposed significant amendments to the Privacy Act that will impact charities and NFPs, beneficial ownership laws as well, and on the very large review of the AUSTRAC legislative regime. It still surprises me when I consider the massive breadth of law and policy changes that impact on this sector.
Thanks, Jo.
Thank you.
Now, I will encourage everyone, if you haven't already, to sign up to our monthly newsletter, The Charitable Purpose, and please encourage any charity leaders you deal with to do the same. The reason I'm suggesting that is it's an excellent way to find out when we publish new guidance, do significant updates, find out about submissions that we hear about that charities might be interested in being involved in themselves. And it's once a month. We try and keep all the latest news in there. It's a just-in-time approach to guidance for the sector and people interested in the sector. There's a link on our homepage to subscribe. The Charitable Purpose. Sign up if you haven't already. Now, our third priority is using our data to maximum effect, and we published the 9th edition of the Charities report recently. We've also set up a new area on our website called the Charity Data Hub, And that's just to consolidate all the reports that we've ever done using the data that we collect, and just to make it a bit easier to access to data.gov files and other areas of interest around data. I was going to ask Mel if he could give us a bit of an overview of the highlights of the 9th Charities report, 9th edition of the Charities report, that had a bit of a facelift.
It did. Thank you, Rachel. So we did some targeted consultation with some key stakeholders who gave us some really, really good feedback about some ideas and things that we should consider in the Charities report. So we made a number of changes. What we did in the latest version is we've included some new geographically based analysis. So that's basically by state and territory. We also included some comparisons against data 3 years ago. Really, really important to start to show trends so that the information can be used to signify what is working, what is of concern, where changes might need to be made, and those sorts of things. In addition to that, we also, as Rachel mentioned, we included more data visualisation. So really trying to enable anyone to access the information and use the data in ways that are meaningful to them, slicing and dicing it for their particular purposes. So one of the other important things has been the conversation, and we've heard today a couple of times, obviously the Productivity Commission are doing their review or inquiry into philanthropy, and so we did some additional analysis and included some information relevant to that context as well, to help inform that work that they are doing, of which we have significant interest in. Now, this morning Sue talked about some of the key points, some of the highlights in terms of the scale, the size, the connectedness and the complexity of the sector. So again, we saw increases in revenue. So that is now at $190 billion annually. We also saw increases in donations, in assets and expenses by charities. Sue mentioned the employment scale. So 10.5% of Australia's workforce are employed by registered charities. So that equates to 1.42 million, a slight increase of 40,000 on the year before. So really, really significant. We've already heard the stat that 50% of charities do not have any paid staff, so rely on volunteers. So a huge amount of effort goes to a vast number of charities in order for them to pursue their charitable purpose and continue their missions. We have seen and we continue to see volunteer numbers declining, which is of concern, I think, to the sector. We have seen a slight decrease in the number of the percentage of charities, so the number of charities that are operating overseas. 6% of charities reported that they are operating overseas. And one of the other things that we've seen is nearly 1/5, so nearly 20% of all charities are grant makers of some kind. And the sheer number, $9.7 billion per annum, is distributed through grants from these organisations, which is massive in scale. So there's a really, really good part of the Charities report. It's a 2-page infographic. I refer to that regularly just to remind myself of the scale and the size of the sector and to get some key information and key statistics. So I would encourage you, even if you don't want to read the whole report, use the data that's available, but also that 2-page infographic will give you a really good key snapshot of the size of the sector that is registered charities in Australia.
Thanks, Mel. Conscious of the time, so I'm going to just skip some of our questions, I think. But as well as using data to promote the amazing work that the sector do, we also use it to identify charities that are not meeting their obligations and to help us design ways that we can improve that compliance with obligations and also improve the data that's on the register. Sally, your team's been doing some data integrity work. Could you tell us briefly about that, please?
think briefly is the key there.
Yeah.
I will be brief, I promise. Okay, so I mentioned earlier there are a couple of elements to the DGR review work that we were doing, and some of that is administrative. When we did the consultations, we heard really clearly that it would be much better if any of those that have got minor issues were dealt with outside of the review process. At the same time, we heard they should not be ignored because public trust and confidence and the transparency of the register is really important. So what we've actually done is we're embedding a specific position within the registration team who will work directly with those charities who have got minor entitlement issues, and they will be the contact. So there'll be a voice to talk to, and they will be able to be dealt with in a much more timely manner. The priorities that we're going to actually be focusing on, and advisors in the room, I'm giving you a heads up here. We're going to look at those cancelled ABNs, so make sure that your charities that you're working with actually have their ABNs up to date, because we are aware that even in the last month or so, there's been 141 cancelled. We also know that there are charities on our register without governing documents, so anybody looking at what they do, it's going to be there's going to be information missing, and there's in excess of 1,800, nearly 1,900 charities on the register that haven't got governing documents, and there are there's 4,500 charities on the register that have only got one responsible person or less. So those are going to be our priority areas. We think it's really important that the person that we embed in the team will be able to support charities through the portal, a bit like some of the feedback we heard earlier on about helping people to get on the portal through a particular issue, and then they learn how to do it for the future. That's what we will be working very closely on trying to achieve.
Thanks, Sal.
Good.
And the last question I'm going to ask is of Rob. So we're looking at how we can make our quality assurance work more efficient and get through more of it. So we've been investigating how we can use artificial intelligence to improve our ability to review financial reports. Rob, could you tell us a bit about that, please?
Sure, I can do that. So ACNC reviews a small sample of the financial reports that are submitted to the charity register, and that's something that we'd really like to increase the sample size of. So we think it's a pretty good use case for the use of technology that we have available within our Microsoft Azure environment. So there's some artificial intelligence and machine learning tools in there that we'd like to leverage in order to do that. And that'll just really streamline the review process for those documents. So that's a pretty exciting piece of work that we're kicking off at the moment, currently. Look, and if that's successful and we can push ahead with it, I think that there's also some opportunity to build some of those learnings and also some of that capability that we switched on and apply that to other processes within ACNC and streamline some of our staff time. So that's pretty exciting. I guess outside of that, you've all heard about ChatGPT, and that's been really popular this year. That's a large language model. The problem with using that in our organisation is that it's really public facing. So any questions that you're feeding into it and prompts that you're feeding in are going into the engine and it's learning, and we have to be careful of our information security. So it's not something we can use. But something that we're really interested in looking at is something called Copilot, which Microsoft is starting to roll out at the moment. It's pretty exciting. It's got the benefits of ChatGPT, but it's private behind the firewall, if you like. So it's something that we're thinking of, looking for opportunities of enabling within our Microsoft environment. And I think there's some really good opportunities there to streamline some of our staff, some of the things that our staff are doing, and just make their life a bit easier. So that's something that my team's certainly very interested in at this point.
Thanks, Rob. I think we could probably keep talking all afternoon between us, but I would like to leave the last 7 minutes for any questions that we might have.
Oh, sorry about that. So this question is for Mel. Do you know if we've got any guidance on how the interaction works with related party transactions and companies?
So there is, as part of the guidance that we obviously have put on our website, there is some information that we've got about the interplay with companies who are limited by guarantee. So I would suggest that that is referred to. So again, www.acnc.gov.au/RPT. Please have a look. I recall from memory it is right down the bottom of the page. So if that is, I guess, unuser friendly, or if there's concerns about that, then we're always happy to hear feedback. But there is that feedback, there is that opportunity to look at the information that is contained on that website. Hopefully that resolves that question.
No, thank you, Mel. One for James. So at last year's Regulators Day, you spoke about board level indicators of risk. Are there any more potential leading indicators for surveillance that you have identified since?
Sure, so probably the AIS data gives us a lot of information around indicators of risk. We like the financial one, and fundamentally the things that you think are problematic financially are indicators of governance risk. So where we see charities with declining revenues over 3 years, charities that are losing government grants, charities that whose assets are declining year on year. And it makes sense to me that if you're struggling financially, maybe your governance doesn't keep up to date, or alternatively, it's the other way around, that your governance is the reason why you are losing your financials. I just mean the charity's not engaging effectively with those sort of sources. So that information is available to the charities. Like, they should know that their financial positions, but we do find that correlated with other sorts of governance problems. The other way that we use that information is getting into activities and locations. So if you are working with particularly vulnerable beneficiaries, if you are working overseas, the things that you are doing are harder and they carry higher risks. And therefore what we would expect is those governance levels to respond and address to those risks. So again, once again, charities know what they're doing and what the activities are, so this information is available to them. I was really interested with Singapore's attestation of the have you reviewed your governance approach. We do have on our website what's called the self-evaluation tool. Any charity can go to it at any time, and it walks them through the sort of governance that they could and should have. It's for them, it's just to do a self-evaluation of where you're at. And we think that if charities take that up, is a good way for them to reflect and then make improvements where they need to.
Thank you, James. The next one's for you, Sally. Can you provide an update on the registration application form update?
I knew Tim was going to ask me a question because he looked at me before he spoke. Yes, the registration application form is currently out to procurement, which means that we have all the specs drawn up. We've gone through lots of consultation, internally and externally. We have now got that document, and once we identify the appropriate person, I'm looking to Rob now as IT, to develop that form for us. It will go into what I hope is full steam ahead, and I would anticipate that we will be testing that form by the end of this calendar year. Rob said yes. So, yeah, that's what I'm anticipating, and I think it's going to make a massive difference. It's a smarter form. What we are going to do is all of the feedback that you gave us, we've actually got in a table now, and once we we start actually developing it, we will feed back all of the things that we have been able to do, which don't quote me on this, but I reckon about 95% of everything everybody suggested we've been able to actually accommodate. So that's great.
I think we've probably got time for one more question.
I think we've got a few more, Rachel. So the next one is actually for you. So in the recent federal budget, the ACNC was funded to complete some work on our secrecy provisions and the reforms associated with that. Can you tell us what we've been doing, or what the ACNC's been doing?
Sure. Obviously, we can't start work on any of the parts of those reforms that relate to... sorry, that was my alarm to tell me to stop. That relate to the changes to what we publish about compliance decisions, or what we say about compliance work, because that actually requires some law change. But what we have done is started work on the piece that is about publishing de-identified registration decisions to register or refuse an application. So we've been, Joe and my team have started working on that. We've had to start by recruiting some staff to do the work. We're working on the specifications for the online library that will house those decisions once we've developed them, looking at what policies and procedures that we need to support that work, and particularly in terms of making sure that we do the de-identification effectively. And I'm hoping that we will be ready to start pushing some of those out around sometime in October.
Thanks, Rachel. So back to Sally. In relation to the DGR reviews, do you contact charities who have been reviewed where you have identified no issues to let them know that they've passed?
No, we don't. And we don't... we talked about this as part of the consultation, and generally the feedback was, don't bother people at all if you don't need to. And so, no, we don't tell anybody they've been reviewed. If they actually wanted to know and they called us, we could tell them. But we don't generally go out and say, hey, look, we just reviewed you and you're okay.
Thank you. Back to you, Melville. FYI, everyone, it was Mel's birthday yesterday. Can you provide an update regarding the national harmonisation of audit requirements and charity sizes?
Well, that's a good question. I guess, look, we've already talked a little bit this morning around harmonisation of the fundraising, the code. Harmonisation of audit requirements is an interesting one. Obviously, we are working with all jurisdictions to try to get harmonisation and the adoption of ACNC thresholds, but it is something that is, I guess, we continue to work with each jurisdiction on. It's not something that we can unilaterally do. It requires working closely with each jurisdiction, noting that each jurisdiction has got its own priorities. So there's nothing that I can report on at this point in time, but it is something that we're always alive to and open to, and we're always willing to support the provision of data, for example, where it can help other jurisdictions to make decisions to enable that streamlining to occur.
Thank you. And I think that's it for this session. Thank you very much.